Guten Morgen.
Morgan. Well, it's great to be here at this reunion of the Austrian School. I've been a follower of, particularly of Hayek for some time, and at one time I never met him, but at one time I had a kind of proximity relationship with him. In the late 50s and early 60s, Professor Hayek taught at University of Chicago, and the University of Chicago is located in a wonderful neighborhood on the lake shore, and many of the faculty members live there. It's Hyde Park. It's called Hyde Park. Wonderful place. In fact, Barack Obama's home is right there in Hyde Park, but nestled up to the University of Chicago. So I never met him then, but I've started to follow him and became a really strong follower of his. And I never imagined, though, two things. 10 years ago, in the year 2000, after we got married, I left the United States and have been living in Europe ever since. It's been great, but the one thing that really surprised me here, living in Vienna, which I otherwise love to do, is I began to slowly understand the neglect, particularly of Hayek. And I could not really comprehend that, because he was such a hero of mine. And, you know, he really understood the world. One of the things I liked about so much is that he was so far ahead of everyone. He saw the world, as we know, he saw the world as a gigantic information feedback machine, self-generating, self-regulating, an extraordinary idea, enhanced, of course, by the advent of the internet and so forth. But the other surprise I have is that the country that embraced this idea, this concept, this understanding, more than any other country in the world, turns out to be China. And that's one of the things we want to talk to you about today.
Well, one of the early things I remember, because we got to know each other as publisher and author. And
it ended very well.
And when he used to call me from the US, I said, don't call me tomorrow because we have a holiday. And John used to say, what? Another holiday? How can you do business in Austria? So
how can you get anything done?
it was quite a difference from the way Americans looked at doing business, as we, in a more relaxed way, thought we can get things done as well. Well, John was referring to Hayek, and when we were talking about this event, it's clearly aware that no matter how important the Austrian school today is, we are looking back, and we are looking quite a ways back. But as we talked about the influence that Hayek and Milton Friedman, by the way, was even directly helping the Chinese in their path to a free market, we thought that maybe one day we will talk about a Chinese school. And that is what has been the purpose of our research in the last years. We were trying to understand, we were working on understanding what is really going on in China.
How many of you have been to China? Well, that's on this side of the room, quite a few. That's very interesting. I think how many people want to go to China? Not really that many more.
And how many of you think that whatever we do is affected by what is happening in China?
The most hands yet. Yeah, well, that's well placed. I've been going to China for more than though you're quite right about my taking this up later. I've been going to China for more than 40 years. The first trip to China was in 1967. I've made at least 100 visits there. And in the last 10 years, Doris and I have been there 20 or 30 times, and we now live there partly. So in all of these trips, over all of these years, of course, some have been great and some have been pretty boring, especially early on. But one of the most memorable visits I had to China was in 1976, when I had a private meeting with President Jiang Zemin. 2-hour conversation. It was extraordinary. But in that conversation, it was at a time when Taiwan was right in the center of the table, because and President Clinton sent an aircraft carrier, and the Chinese have lobbed missiles sort of close to Taiwan. It was very tense. So that was the elephant in the room, and we came to talk about it. And at one point I said to President Jiang, you know, Taiwan has a very small story to tell, but it tells it very, very well. And I said, China has a big story to tell, and you're doing a terrible job telling it. Silence. Finally, he said, why don't you tell it? He said, we'll give you all the support you need. Unfortunately, at the time, I was unable to accept that invitation. I think I wasn't ready, but there were some other things that prevented that. But then, later on...
Yeah, 10 years ago, 10 years ago, I started going to China, and we have ever since then traveled together. 10 years after you met Jiang Zemin, in 2006, the offer came back. And it was at a meeting where we got to know a man who is the head of the China Merger and Acquisition Association. And it was very interesting because we got to know a lot already in this meeting about how modern the thinking is. But nevertheless, this man, Wang Wei, said to John, you know, we really don't know what's going on in China. Why don't you find out? And this time, we were really both very engaged in finding the answer, and we got a lot of help because we couldn't do it alone. Very soon, we found the Naisbitt China Institute in Tianjin, where we, with the help of our Chinese friends, have 28 people. We have professors and we have entrepreneurs and students and graduates with whom we were starting to really monitor China in all the provinces and all the cities, not all, but the main cities, to really find out what is going on bottom up, just as John did 82 in Megatrends when 1982 when he was doing Megatrends.
And I might add that the Naisbitt China Institute, which Doris directs, is a standalone, independent institution. We are housed at Tianjin University of Finance and Economics, but that was given to us. That was volunteered by the university because they kind of like to have us there. And we've had some voluntary help, and people wanted to work with us on their own and so forth. But we are totally independent, standalone in that regard. Now, so we started to monitor China, all the provinces, the local newspapers, because I have this idea that all over the world, what is going on is what is going on locally, and that's as true as Austria as it is of China. So the way you monitor that is to get all the information from all around the country, and we did that by the local newspapers, which in China today are just so open and free. The two biggest issues they deal with by far are, and they editorialize about, are corruption, and the environment. Papers are just full of that. So we're monitoring what's going on locally and trying to see what the patterns are and what all that adds up to. And we initially got off on a little wrong path because we were patterning after what I did with Megatrends, which was monitoring the locations all over the United States. But we realized at some point we were looking at change, and there was tremendous change, in a very well-established society. Here in China, we realized that what we're looking at was something quite different and something much more important than we had thought. And that is, China was in the process of creating an entirely new social economic system from scratch. Well, that sounded even more interesting than we had thought, and that's where we started to really get going, and where our researchers got very excited, and where we started to spend all our time in China.
Yeah, I think one of the main things was that when we had no real direction, all our people at the Naisbitt China Institute in the beginning said, what do we really look for? Can you give us a direction? And we said, the only direction we can give to you is look for facts. No opinions, no, we are planning to do this, we are planning to do that. Just report to us what has happened, and only facts. And by that only, we knew that the patterns would slowly appear. Now, when as John said, of course our thinking somehow works by the roots of the past. So, as John said, Megatrends was based on from to. So we already had 8 or 9 or 10 from to, which happened in China and which are absolutely happening. But some feeling told us this is not it.
Yeah.
And that's when we had the breakthrough that we have to throw our trends away that we have, because what we are looking for is how is this new system that is being created, what is the foundation of this system, not what are the consequences. Like, to give you an example, we were having the big trend from rural to urban. This is true. Centralization to decentralization. But
true.
this
Also
were
true.
only the consequences of what was going on, what was resting on the foundations. And at that point, we knew we had to look at China in a different way. And the next...
I think that was our second breakthrough.
Our
second breakthrough was on China as an enterprise.
Yes,
right?
correct. The second breakthrough was that we realized that the reinvention of China happened as if it was an enterprise. And the approach that the leaders had to it was as if it was an enterprise. Now this made many things for us much better understandable. For example, if you picture a huge enterprise, nobody would have the first request, now let's have an election and elect our CEO. The best man, the CEO of China, so to say, appeared, and he fought his way up to the top. It was quite a tough fight, as you know, until Deng Xiaoping became the paramount leader of China. And he became, so to say, the CEO of China. Now, what was the first thing he did? He had a rundown, moribund, almost dead country. And he needed to breathe life into that country. He had to enable the people who were paralyzed by ideology, and by ideology thinking, to get on their feet. So
he had to move from indoctrination to emancipation, to liberalization of the mind. Interesting place to start.
So the key for him, and the first and most important pillar of the system, of the new system, was the emancipation of the minds.
of the mind.
Of people who would think for themselves and who would do their share.
By the way, you never hear anything about that in the West because maybe it's not understood or that it's not realized how important that is, but that's exactly what they talk about. They use the phrase, the emancipation of the mind, the release, the freeing up of the mind for people to think for themselves, not to follow all of the indoctrinated paths.
The next step was, of course, to get a structure in the decision-making process of the enterprise. Now, it was clear that the CEO and the management would not be changed. China has what the West calls an autocratic government, and the leadership was clear. But to make this system sustainable, to make it work, there had to be an exchange between the people and the leadership. So what we call the second pillar of the system, it's top-down, bottom-up interplay. The leadership began to listen. What are the demands of the people? What are the needs of the people? And one of the first things Deng Xiaoping realized was that he said, we have to look at the truth by facts.
Yeah. We have to look at the facts to get the truth. In translation, it's a little murky anyway. Yeah, but it's learning the truth through facts, or looking at the facts to get the truth.
As any ideology, it was glorifying the conditions, and only when they... We have a friend in China who told us a story about his mother, who was very poor, but made it possible that her children would study. And at that time, when China started its reforms in 1978, she said to her son, only when you step out of the field, you can see the dirt on your feet. And that's what China did. China stepped out, and then they could see the dirt on their feet, and they started working on it.
Let me just add something. I want to add something about this truth, getting the truth from facts. You probably all know about Deng's cat. Deng Xiaoping, it's an old saying, but he made it famous. He said, it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, so long as it catches the mice. And what he meant by that is, very explicitly, I don't care if it's capitalism or communism. I want the cat that catches the mice. And that was part of the emancipation. That was part of the freeing up.
Of course, when knowing the history of China, this was not a population that was used to making decisions. They needed frames in which they could operate, something to hold on. So what the government the leadership started to do was creating frames in which the people could move, and those frames, of course, over time got bigger and bigger and bigger, and today they are in of course, different frames and much better. One of the most which you like very, very much, and which is for anybody, for any entrepreneur, for any company, one of the very good thing is what we call the pillar number 4.
Crossing the river by feeling the stones. Great advice for everyone in life, but it's a very, very ancient Chinese saying, crossing the river by feeling the stones. And adjust your course across the river depending on what you feel and what happens, and you move this way or you move that way. And that's a very important distinction between the Chinese thinking and the Western thinking. Almost all Chinese cross the river by feeling the stones. In the West, we cross the river by following the contract, clause by clause by clause, no matter what stones we're stepping on. And that's why the Chinese don't like contracts. Because the people in the West say, we've got to do paragraph 17. Where are we done? And the Chinese say, well, wait a minute. something's happened and that doesn't matter anymore. So it's a very different kind of mentality that addresses particularly the business problems.
Yeah, the first frame, for example, was so wide, it was just to eliminate poverty and change from backwardness to modernity. This was a very, very wide frame in which slowly, and John will, we will get back to that, what the first of the bottom-up initiatives were to operate within this frame. Then, of course, and one of the basics also was that they allowed, crossing the river by feeling the stones allows trial and error. This was at the time, 78, 1 billion people. Now, how do you get 1 billion people from dirt poor and not educated? 117,000 people of the whole population had academic degrees. It was, as you know, academics through the Cultural Revolution were persecuted. So that was a real U-turn, and they had to, the Chinese feared to make mistakes. So it was very important to allow
But since that time, they've sort of institutionalized trial and error. Trial and error has never been tried on such a scale before, and there's a lot of error. That's the point. When it doesn't work, as with Deng's cat, you stop doing it. You all know about the special economic zones. That was a trial. It had been tried in other countries, and that was part of the trial and error. To try out, they worked out very well, so they proceeded. But lots of errors were made, but they dropped them. But they were doing trial and error across the board.
Then, with the slowly increasing freedom people had. Artistic and intellectual ferment was feeding the markets. And the artists were, of course, the front runners and the
They were in front of the parade because, you know, artists are entrepreneurs, obviously. There are different kinds of entrepreneurs, but artists, so it was the entrepreneurs, including the artists, the entrepreneurs that first saw the opportunities, seized the opportunities for the opening up. In China, you talk about this period of the last 30 years since Deng Xiaoping took over, you talk about it, the reforms and opening up. The reforms and opening up. That's what it's called. That's what how everyone speaks of it.
Yeah, we slipped. I just noticed we slipped a little bit away from linking it to the enterprise, how we started. But it's easy that in an enterprise you have to set a goal with which people can identify, because only when they identify with the goal they are willing to do their share. Just as Nikki said, moving together and seeing that we want to move something together. That is what China did. And then crossing the river by feeling the stone, of course, in a company you never know what chance comes and what opportunity is opening on the way. And as in a company, often the uncomfortable people are the most creative people. It was in China the same. And the creative people, the artists and the intellectual were increasingly listened to. The government increasingly listened to the entrepreneurs. Then, of course, China needed to start opening to the markets, to the world. And that was another process that slowly began in 1978, and by now, and of course with joining the WTO and so forth in 2000, today China has its doors wide open. The problem China deals with and every company deals with is what is fair and how far does freedom go. Not everybody has the same talent, not everybody has the same diligence in whatever we do. So China is today very much aware of the fact that there's this huge gap between rural and urban, and between the East Coast, where the incomes are pretty high, and the rural areas where they have to really attend to the people to raise the income. No enterprise would survive by starting by continuing the process of doing products which also somebody else is doing. So China knows it has to keep up growth. And the goal China has today is to move from imitation to innovation. And this is very strongly supported by many, many things the government does and the new frames and opportunity the government gives to the people.
This description of China as a company is, in fact, what China has been doing. With these, we call these the pillars, the 8 pillars. Should we read the 8 pillars?
No,
do later? Okay, we'll come back to that. The 8 pillars. There's one part of this that's very, very important, and that's the whole idea of bottom-up, top-down and bottom-up, the dynamic between top-down directions and bottom-up initiatives. And I want to give you 2 examples of the bottom-up initiatives, because so much in China is started bottom-up and then becomes later national policy. The most famous one, and the one everybody in China knows about, is the one about the 18 farmers way up in an obscure province up in the northeast. These 18 farmers were part of a collective. All farmers were part of a collective. That was true all over China. One day in late 78, 18 farmers got together and they said, this is ridiculous. If we each take 1/18, if each family takes 1/18 of the share of the land that we're farming, some of us are going to do very good, some of them, and those laggards are going to have to pay for not working hard enough. And they signed a pact, all of them signed a pact that they would divide this collective into 18 parts. This was totally against the law. They risked death, they risked everything to do this very early in Deng's tenure. Well, and by the way, today you can see the document in the National Museum in Beijing where they all put their blood on it and swore that no matter what happened, they're going to stick to it. It turned out the local government supported them. And in very few months, their productivity started to go up. The words got around. Deng Xiaoping learned about it. In 5 months, that bottom-up initiative went from the 18 farmers to national policy. No more collective farms. Individual farming in China starting in 1979. An incredible bottom-up initiative. There's a recent one just codified this year, a couple of months ago. For some years now, because in this decentralized country, and you have to understand that China is the most decentralized country in the world and decentralizing more and more. The provinces started to make deals with other countries directly, not through Beijing, but directly. They started to make deals with companies directly. This has been going on for some time, and Beijing has been ignoring it. Now they've given in. Last month they announced that that any deals made between the provinces and the rest of the world directly had to be okayed by Beijing if they were over $100 million. But anything below that was okay. This is another more recent bottom-up initiative, but it's this interplay of the top-down and bottom-up that's so important to China, and we've given this whole thing a name. Do you want to talk about that?
When we were at that point, we were still not satisfied with one thing. We knew China was reinventing as an enterprise. We knew there was a strong interplay between top-down and bottom-up. But the child didn't have a name, so to say. When you ask a Chinese, what is your system called? The Chinese cannot give you an answer. When we ask you, what would you call the Chinese system?
You have lots of answers, probably. What do you call it? Anyone?
How would you describe the political system in China?
What do you say?
Communism. We heard communism, and what else? Capitalism.
Pretty good. but there are a lot of capitalists, but we've found no communists in China, by the way. None. What?
You found him? You found communists.
I think this is, our interpreter's grandfather.
Yeah.
We have an interpreter whose grandfather is still hanging in there in his Maoism. There are some Maoists in China, of course.
Anyway, what China is usually described of is socialism with Chinese characteristics.
At one point I said to the Chinese, I said, well, that's okay, because now America is socialism with American characteristics.
Yeah. So we were torturing our heads. What is the system? What can it be called? And as we could not come to a name, we started to make a drawing or drawings. And this is what we did. Can you see this?
There's this, I think that's because this is in front of us.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, is that now fine? Okay, we started with what we knew, with the Western system. And we thought that the West, has a horizontal structure. All people are equally entitled to vote their leadership. So periodically, in the Western democracy, the leadership is elected. This was very easy to see. Now we said, how is the structure we see in China? We have, I take a new one. We have a pretty wide leadership, and the number of the members of the Communist Party, because this way we can say China has 73 million communists, because China has the Communist Party of China has 73 million members. But the leadership, of course, is structured in a very wide way, and then we have the people. And in this structure, we have top-down directions, and we have bottom-up initiatives. And by looking at this, it was clear to us that the structure of the Chinese system is vertical. So we call this a vertical democracy. And of course, what we are very much aware of is that this is a system which is in the beginning of its shaping up. We often forget that the Western democracy was found about 200 years ago. And if we look only 50, 70 years back, how Western democracies looked, and for example, how in the US black people were not allowed to vote, were not even allowed to go to restaurants and so forth.
Well, they were slaves for 150 years under the so-called American democracy.
Within the democracy. In the West, women couldn't vote and so forth. So it is clear that the maturing process that the Western horizontal democracy went through, the Chinese vertical democracy is going through as well. And we believe it is not more than 1/3 to where it will go to. Now, what is the strength of the system? Why do we think that we can expect a lot of power, a lot of dynamic from the system? In our system, to simplify it, we have Party A and Party B. Now, Party A, of course, has to be elected, neglect everything Party B says. Party B says no, more or less, to everything Party A says. So the result is, and I think in the US it's currently very strong.
Yeah, even with this new guy, Obama, who seems extraordinary, the parliament is paralyzed. And with everyone, one party voting one way, the other party voting another way, and it's kind of a mess.
Also, Party A can always take Party B as a scapegoat, and Party B can use Party A as a scapegoat. Now, we do not want to glorify the Chinese system. There are many lacks of the system. The Chinese leadership is often overreacting to things. They have not yet digested their past. They still hold on to certain things and freak out when they feel that the system as a whole is in danger. And there is no question, as big as the freedom of the individual has become, when the Chinese leadership thinks that the system is in danger, then they react. But this leadership has a constancy. That means they do not need to think in election terms. They can set very long-term goals, and then they make the single steps to reach that goal, and they don't have to worry about the other party proving them wrong. What they do is increasingly listening to the bottom up. So these forces are getting much stronger, and of course the leadership has to take 100% responsibility for whatever they do. There is no one they can blame if things go wrong but themselves. So this is just, oops.
Oh, good. It's interesting that that this new system that is making such extraordinary progress is happening just at a time when we look around at Western democracy and see that it's in pretty big trouble. It's kind of, I use the word paralyzed. A lot of the parliaments in the country are paralyzed. The EU is floundering. We have a lot of trouble explaining to the Chinese, for example, with the EU, how you can vote against something, and the EU said, well, you voted the wrong way, so now you have to vote again. They say, well, what kind of democracy is that? And we say, well, it has its flaws, you know. And so as we look around the world, we see that Western democracy and the West is in decline versus the East, and just at a time when the West ought to get its act together because the East is becoming so strong economically, just at this time, in my lifetime, which is quite a long span, I've never seen the Western parliaments so inept and so unable to get things done, and that's multiplied by the EU, in which most people are losing a lot of interest. It's even become pretty boring. But I want to put that in perspective, the economics in perspective here. You know that China today is 2/3 private sector. 2/3 private sector. Now, in the state sector, you have a lot of the very important industries, without question. Steel industry is still the state sector. Banks are still state sector, although starting this trial and error experimentation with private banks a little bit around, and coal and transportation is still state sector. But 2/3 of the economy of China is private sector. Now, the economy has grown so incredibly that here, this country that started out just 30 years ago, such a backward, poverty-riven country, just became, as we know, the 3rd largest economy in the world. Next year, 2010, it will become the 2nd largest economy in the world. Number 2, how did they do that? How did they do that? That's a pretty important question. That's why we ought to be interested. Not only we want to know how they did it and how, if they might do more of it, but we might learn something. Imagine, we might even learn something. I want to put that in perspective. China just passed Germany as the third largest economy in the world. Will pass Japan as the second economy in the world next year. But these three countries, Germany, China, and Japan, have GDPs, all of them, between 4.5 and 5.5 trillion. And what's happened is that China now, in that little narrow band, is going to move next year into number 2 to Japan. But they're all within the 4.5 and 5.5 trillion thing. The U.S. economy is 14 trillion. I mean, it's way the hell up there. And people will say, well, in the next few years, China's going to overtake U.S. It just is not possible. First of all, the U.S. is not going to just wait for China to catch up, and it may grow 2 or 3%. China can keep growing at 10%, and it will still take 20 years to catch up if it ever does. And we think that Germany, Japan, and Germany, of the three, I'm sorry, Japan and Germany will probably not grow very much in the next several years. It'll be fairly static and maybe lose some ground. China will grow very fast. U.S. will continue to grow moderately, but still that gap will be a long time before that gap is overtaken.
In the beginning, we were
in
the beginning we were putting the question to you: how many think that whatever happens in China is important to us? And one thing we thought of, if we, the U.S. always has been called in the last 50 years the land of unlimited opportunities and possibilities. Now the U.S. has now 300 million people and a huge potential, of course, of talent with which the U.S. can keep up its competitiveness, or is fighting for its competitiveness in the global economy. Now, if we put that picture to China with a government that can set goals, that is then creating the environment in which those goals can be achieved, and now it's to become the innovation nation of the world. If 1.3 billion people with an efficient government and efficient frames is putting all its energy into reaching that goal, then it will be able to change the conditions of global trade.
It's not only the Chinese. Remember all the programs they've got of bringing people in. The Chinese, one of the many programs of getting brains and talent to come to China is that they're trying to get the top 5 of the top 10 in every industry and every in biotechnology, in energy, in electric cars, whatever. And they have these programs. Come and study in China to our university for 6 months or a year and a half, whatever you want to do. Come and study here. We will bring you here. The allowance for travel and getting settled is $146,000 US. That's just to get you to come there and set up shop, and to get things. They're oversubscribed. They've got to slow the program down because they've got to take so many each year. So this is part of a much larger innovation program. They talk about being an innovation country, as every country on the planet does. But the Chinese seem to be putting their money where their mouth is, their brains where their mouth is, to get more people to come, so that the mix, because it's always the mix of talent that produces the results. And they understand that, and they're trying to get a great mix of very high talent. So we don't know where that's going to go, but so far it started this shift away from imitation to innovation, as you said. And for example, electric cars. They are out to be the electric car capital of the world, and they're well on their way. The BYD car, I think you mentioned with Warren Buffett. Did you mention that?
No.
Oh, I'll mention that. Warren Buffett is the largest foreign stockholder in BYD. We got from Mr. Wang, the head of it, we got a model, a beautiful model of their electric car. and they're starting to sell electric cars in the United States next year, 2010, starting to sell them in Europe in 2011. But this is duplicated in biotechnology and in robotics and...
I think the questions.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so what about the pillars? I would like to...
Go ahead.
No. Oh, do you remember what the pillars are? Emancipating, the first is emancipating the mind. The second pillar is...
From top down and bottom up.
The third pillar...
Framing the forest.
Yeah, I love this.
Letting
Framing
the trees
forest
grow.
and letting the trees grow. Framing the forest and letting the trees grow. And then
Crossing the river by feeling the stones.
Remember that?
Intellectual and artistic ferment.
Joining the world.
Freedom and fairness.
And the last one is from Nobel Prizes, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. From Olympic gold medals to Nobel Prizes. That's the direction they see they're going. If we had to put one more pillar in, that pillar would be competition. Competition in China is unbelievable. Competition between the cities, between the provinces. You know, Beijing put on what we all saw, probably the most spectacular Olympics, at least in the ceremonies, of the world. Now, next year, 2010, Shanghai is going to have the World Expo. Guess what? Two things. They're going to have the greatest World Expo ever seen, and they're going to beat Beijing and make Beijing's treatment of the... And the competition among companies is Darwinian in China, and they don't care if they fail, because that's how you get better companies, letting the best ones survive and not trying to prop them up and giving them the subsidies to keep going when they shouldn't be keep going. So competition is, I guess, our ninth pillar. Okay, that's it. Maybe we should invite, I think we have a few minutes. Maybe we invite a few questions from the floor. 2 more minutes.
Can you get us some more?
The Chinese way is in the Western media, I think we haven't talked about the dark side. And also the high rate of death penalties.
High rates of what?
Of death penalties.
And you might add pollution.
Pollution. And I think my question is that's I think often a target of the Western media, and my question is it maybe is it essential, or is it does China need to be that strong with fining people for small crimes like corruption? Like drug trafficking.
First you complain about corruption, then you say they give them the death penalty for corruption. You say, well, that's too much penalty. I mean, that's what I'm talking about, the Western press.
I thought so, because if you look how people are stealing right now money in the Western world with Wall Street friends business, with Austrian ex-finance minister friends business,
good contrast.
That we need kind of these strong fines to make sure the system will survive, because otherwise we might end up with revolution here when people find out how people are stealing money from our democracy. Could that be a reason that China is kind of, it might be not so a wrong way as we normally think?
We have about 30 seconds. A, we continue to judge China from Western eyes. B, China is not marching in the direction of Western democracy the way we see it, but they talk a lot about human rights. Human rights is a big problem there, particularly in the eyes of the West, who think China should overnight become like the West when it took the West hundreds of years. So, you know, it's a relative judgment, and I like they pay attention to the penalties that the U.S. gives to the Wall Street people who take millions and billions of dollars. But it's an immature system, and it's got a long way to go, and you have to judge it in its potential and in what it seems, in the direction it seems very much to be going. But hell, we could spend all the rest of the day telling you what's wrong with China, and the Chinese talk about what's wrong and what has still to be done more than anybody in public forums. And the newspapers. It's amazing.
Well, thank
So
you.
they've got a long way to go. So.